Well, welcome, and just thank you all for coming out. I want to say thank you to Gregory, who also is the vice chair of the board here, and his work, both as an intellectual around questions of urban education, and then to Nathan, who has made me sound a lot more intelligent than I am as my editor, and even when I try to fight with him, I always relinquish and understand that he is right. And then Jeff Sharlett, whose work I came to know when he wrote the afterword to Dispatches from the Religious Left, an anthology that I'm privileged to be a part of, is arguably the best writer on religion of our generation. And so it's just such a privilege for me to be here with him. I want to just kind of lay out that we're going to engage in some conversation. The kind of frame for us is that what we kind of embody is that Jeff's work has been significant in unpacking and unearthing and revealing to us the role of the religious right, and my work as an organizer and pastor and as of late as a writer is to offer some alternatives to that construction. And so, Jeff, I'm just thinking about what we've hear a lot about with the Obama presidency, much of the conversation around common ground, and that it is my belief that the religious right, the Republican Party is out of power. It is out of office, but the religious right is not out of power. And so, and central to that is the nucleus of the family. And so if you could kind of lay out what the religious right and the family represent for us in this moment.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good distinction to say that the religious right is not in office, but not necessarily out of power. And that, just that we met through this book, Dispatches from the Religious Left, and it was your essay in that book. There's a lot of good pieces in there, but that particular piece crackled. I mean, it was just sort of understood that this is a fight. And that this is not something that's decided solely in the electoral arena, that the religious right continues to sort of exert power regardless of whether or not they're in office. And one of the ways, I think one of the big ways in which they've done that for a long time is through this group called The Family, which I've written about. The Family, just to sort of give you a quick overview, is the oldest and arguably the most influential religious conservative organization in Washington, and yet most people haven't heard of it. The leader of the group, a guy named Doug Coe, he preaches, he says, the more invisible you can make your organization, the more influence it will have, which is true. But it's also not, it points to sort of the really fundamentally anti-democratic motives of this organization. And I often find myself in this odd situation when I'm in leftist circles, in which I count myself a part, because I'll defend Pat Robertson and the late Jerry Falwell and Jim Dobson and all those guys. We all know who they are. We'll probably in this room all disagree with them, and it's easy for us to disagree with them because we know what they believe, because they're out there in the open. And they are participating in democracy, maybe not toward democratic ends, but they're in the public square. The Family doesn't believe in the public square. The Family is this group that began 70 years ago with the idea that Christianity has been getting it wrong for 2,000 years by focusing on the poor and the weak and the down and out. That instead God wants to work through those whom he apparently said one night in April 1935. He appeared in a vision to the founder of the group. God wants to work through those whom he called the up and out, the elites. And to that end, the Family has been organizing for 70 years. Not the masses, not public revivals, but congressmen, business people, military leaders, foreign leaders. I'll just sort of, the one thing that you might have heard about them, or actually two things. They organize something called the National Prayer Breakfast every year, at which the president always speaks, most of Congress attends. It's a very bland, boring event. Around it is a big lobbying festival. And then they also got into the news this summer, and some of you might be familiar with this. There's a senator from Nevada, a guy named John Ensign, who had an affair. He paid off his mistress. He was a fourth-ranking Republican, and he was living in this house the family owns called the C Street House. And there was a governor from South Carolina, Mark Sanford, who yeah, exactly. Who went hiking on the Appalachian Trail, giving us a whole new euphemism to work with. And he also was seeking counseling at this C Street house. And there was a third guy, actually, a congressman from Mississippi named Chip Pickering. And if you saw Borat and you remember an idiotic congressman, that's him. And he was actually meeting his mistress in the family C Street house, registered as a church. Then he did the right thing. He resigned from Congress in order to become a lobbyist for her corporation. So that's the family. But the key thing that I think is relevant to our discussion is, just, I'm talking about senators and congressmen and governors and so on. I'm not talking about the pulpit pounders, the Bible thumpers, the televangelists you see on TV. These guys have been around and they endure precisely because they're insiders. They're part of the establishment. They're not knocking on the door from outside. And I think that goes right to the issues that Sekou raises in his work about the sort of enduring power of this movement. Why does this movement endure even when there seems to be a widespread public repudiation of them? Mm-hmm. So I turn it back to you.
Well, one of the questions that I've consistently wrestled with, and I guess my public and private fights have been, is within the Beltway, there is this kind of emphasis on common ground. I wrote this critique of the Come Let Us Reason Together document, and when Robbie Jones conferred, I have a good lawyer so I can name names, compared me to Tony Perkins.
We got that. Robbie Jones, you got to
Robbie Jones is a pollster and who does work, and actually is a good guy, but does work for polling for Democratic candidates, in particular around questions of religion. And so, and has accused many of us who stand outside and bear critique, Peter Larm and those of us who are part of this. The Dispatch's book has become a kind of catch-all for anyone who pushes against the religious rights establishment in the way in which neoliberals are conceding that territory. So I'd like to hear a little more from you about the ways in which religious right discourse has become normalized in the public sphere, right? Yeah. And that those of us who stand outside of it and bear a critique on it are often says we're outside of the mainstream and that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, it's very simple, Sekou. Don't you just want to get along? No. I mean, that's the line that these guys are saying. The family, this group, about 30 years ago, decided, you know what, if we just say reconciliation over and over and over, then everyone will love us. And if we do prison work, so one of their recruits is a guy named Chuck Colson, who was Nixon's sort of hatchet man.
And he did a stretch, right?
He did he likes it to be sort of thought that he did a stretch. He did a very comfortable 6 months, after which he was paroled very early. Actually, the family wrote the letters to the parole board. It says he is needed for religious work. And he was brought out. And now this is where it gets interesting, because why did they forgive this guy who had been such a fundamental part of Watergate? His chief champion was a member of this group, the family, a senator, a guy named Harold Hughes, fairly liberal Democrat from Iowa, opponent of the Vietnam War. He very devout evangelical, but was he taken by this language of reconciliation. He also became a big champion of Ferdinand Marcos.